This is Rhett Read Podcast.
We take a deep dive into the Fear Street series
And review other books we've read.
I'm Serge.
And I'm Anna.
We're happy you can join us.
Hey there, Rhett Readers.
Welcome back to another exciting episode of Rhett Read Podcast. This is like the moment a lot of you have been waiting for. We've gotten so many messages from fans saying like, when are you guys going to do the Fear Street Sagas? We're finally tackling the first of the Fear Street Sagas, but first,
we're going to review two books that we've read.
To begin with, I'm going to review Myth and Madness by Daniel Hryhorczuk. You're going to think to yourself, Serge, why do you keep reading books you don't like? Because this book, I'm like on the fence between like a 2 and a 3 out of 5 stars. It's got so many problems.
Well, what initially drew you to the book and what is it about?
What drew me to the book was the name, Myth and Madness. Okay, that's gonna grab me. It's got myth in the title. I'm a sucker for myths. And then it turns out it's actually about the latest Maidan revolution in Ukraine back in the winter of 2013 to 2014. I followed those events pretty closely. They kind of like played a big role in my life. I think I devolved into just refreshing the news feed and just watching live streams for a few months there.
Well, full disclosure, you were from Ukraine.
Correct, yeah. I'm from Kiev originally, and the main protest took place in Kiev. The point is, I was very excited about this book because it has things that I care about in it, and that's generally a good indicator that I'm going to like the book. Right off the bat, I could tell that this thing's going to be a little bit problematic. The author, Daniel, clearly also kind of had the same perspective that I did. And I guess he was probably watching the live feeds and refreshing the news stream much the same way. It's not an eyewitness account. And okay, fine, so it's fiction, right? So it wouldn't be an eyewitness account anyway, but it's not even coming from that eyewitness perspective. He wasn't there. He did come to visit the Maidan, he says, a few months after the events, and like saw the remains of the barricades or whatever, but that's not the same thing.
Surely you don't need to have been an eyewitness to be able to write a book about an event.
That's true. But what he wrote was like a fan fiction. He consumed all the news media and reports and live streams, and then he boiled it down to what is essentially a fanfic of the Maidan.
There's nothing wrong with that either.
There's, in theory, no. And the book had like a lot of good aspects, right? The way the myth was tied in. It had a lot of old Ukrainian fairy tales and myths and legends just woven into the framework of the story. And that was really nice. That was like probably my favorite part of the book.
You know, you keep saying that it's problematic.
Okay,
so...
yeah. I mean, it was a fanfic, and it was a bad fanfic because the main characters in the story were really one-dimensional. Basically, we have somebody that's trying to portray the Maidan protests in a good, positive light, which is fine. You know, I agree with that. I thought that was probably a good thing for Ukraine and necessary to stand up to corruption and so forth. But what he's doing is he's taking, like, these characters and he's turning them into, like, one-dimensional caricatures. So he's got a guy from the right sector, which was one of the paramilitary sort of far-right movements that joined the protests. And these guys were like cast to be like neo-Nazis, and that was one of the main driving points of the Russian news media. Okay, these guys, they're going to turn Ukraine into a fascist dictatorship, blah, 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 right? So he wants to make this guy seem like he's a really cool guy to counteract that, but he just came off like a caricature. And then you've got this lost soul of an artist slash storyteller who's the main character, Nick. Nick is just, first he's lovesick for this girl, Slavyanka, who's actually in love with Yuri, the right sector guy, but he's like, she's not gonna like me. So then he falls for Natalka, which is this other woman, who is one of the baddies in the book, but you know right from the beginning that she's gonna turn to the good side. So blatantly obvious. Nick, the narrator, I guess he's fine, but he doesn't really grow that much as a character. There's a scene at the beginning where he doesn't intervene to help his friends and they get beat up by the police, and he feels bad about that, and then later on, that comes back, and he decides he's going to take a more active role, and he's going to help his friends instead of being a bystander and a journalist. That character arc is like taking one step on a 20-step staircase, you know? It's not a very grand arc that he's gone on. It's not a huge voyage of self-discovery that he's gone through here.
Isn't that in some ways more realistic?
I guess so, but the other main character, Natalka, who I already mentioned, she actually does go on this huge arc of self-discovery where she goes from being pro-Russian and sympathizing with the corrupt authorities that are being protested against, and then she goes to like switching to the other side. in portraying the Maidan in a positive light, he went too far and he made it seem like basically a propaganda piece.
Does the book cover at all what happens in eastern Ukraine after what happened in the Maidan?
No, it cuts off right after everybody goes to the presidential palace and walks around and looks at the golden toilet and the giant galleon floating in the pool and
weren't there
the car collection,
exotic animals and stuff?
Yeah, the exotic animals. Yeah,
I remember
so that's the last scene of the book.
So it doesn't go into what happens in Donetsk.
No, and the ending is really rushed. The main baddie, his conclusion is not super satisfying. That part is really rushed. It's almost like an afterthought to sort of tie up the Natalka-Nick plotline that's been foreshadowed ad nauseum by the mythical aspect of the book, and then it ends up being a giant nothing burger. The ending was probably the most disappointing part of the book for me.
I know it takes place during the Maidan, and the core of the book revolves around the Maidan. All the characters are made up. Does it have any of the things that actually happened in terms of what was going on in the Maidan, or is it just using the Maidan as a setting and then with a bunch of made-up characters? Does it have the moment when the president flees, or...
Yes. So I feel like the answer to your question is yes, because what you asked is are the events true to what happened? And it's yes, and then that's used as a setting. It's set in the actual Maidan with the events as they actually took place, including excerpts of speeches, verbatim, and things like that.
So you said that there's a lot of mythological elements?
Yes, there is.
Is it magical realism, or how does that work?
Kind of, yeah. So it could be magical realism, or they could all just be crazy. They do end up in an insane asylum, and they're being experimented upon by this crazy Soviet psychologist. Eventually, the other doctor, Natalka, starts seeing stuff too, but, for all you know, she's being drugged. And then Nick was probably crazy from the beginning. It's hard to say. There is a Baba Yaga character, and she's at the Maidan, and she can shift into different forms, and then she's neither good nor evil, but what she sees is that there's a rot and sickness upon the land, and she wants to expel the forces of the dragon, which are personified as these Russian secret agents. If you're ethnically Russian or from Russia, you might be really offended reading this book and might end up throwing it or something, because some of the views here that are voiced by some of the characters are very unkind to Russia, and you might even think the Russian people as well.
The excerpt of the book that I read seemed kind of sexist as well.
Yes, I've been thinking about that. Some of the characters are kind of sexist, especially Yuri, but then even when Yuri's trying to not be sexist, he comes off as sexist anyway, and so that makes me think that maybe the author is just struggling to write in a non-sexist way. Definitely, that is one of the problematic aspects of this book that you might really latch onto and not enjoy for that reason.
When I talked to you while you were reading this, it did sort of come off like you were enjoying it because a lot of it lined up with what you were thinking at the time of the Maidan.
Correct.
Do you feel like if you didn't have that connection, this book would have gone
garbage? It's garbage. If you don't have... You've hit exactly the point here. This is why I hesitate to even give it 3 stars. I mean, yes, I liked it, so that means 3 stars, but then somebody might look at my review and go oh, maybe I should read it. Don't. Only read it if you followed the Maidan and you're in favor of the outcome. But basically, yeah, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's the fan fiction aspect of it. Fan fictions are written for fans of a story. And so if you're a fan of this story, you're going to enjoy it in a really trashy sort of way.
I've read fantastic fan fiction that transcends wherever it comes from. Mm-hmm. So just because something's fan fiction doesn't mean it has to be trash, is all I have to say.
Right. Well, sadly, this one did not transcend anything. I'm not sure why I even finished it.
You seemed really into the book.
You can't really put it down. The mythical aspect of it kept me going for sure. I was honestly reading it to find out what happens in the fairy tale, because throughout the book, Nick is telling this fairy tale. The events in the book sort of mirror what's happening in the fairy tale, and it's supposed to be a thing. But for me, it was what's going to happen in the actual fairy tale? And the real world events were a little bit secondary. And the best aspect of the real world events was, for me, the Baba Yaga character and her various appearances throughout the book. And then all the problematic stuff was really just getting in the way, basically. I'm going to give it, 2.5 rounds up to 3 stars for me for this book. And I'll be reviewing it on Goodreads pretty soon. I feel like 2 times in a row now that I'm reviewing a myth-themed book. First it was Evolutions, now we got Myth and Madness. Both of them are supposed to sort of intertwine the idea of myth into something else. So the first one intertwines the idea of myth into a popular science book, and now we got the idea of myth intertwined into a story about the Maidan in a sort of magical realism sort of way. Great concepts, both of them, but sounds like I really need to go back and find a book that does make myth work. Again, going back to last year where we reviewed the 10th October Day book, that worked. It took a lot of Celtic mythology, put it into a fantasy book that worked. That was well done. I need to find more books like that.
Well, I know we got one at Book Expo or Book Con that actually does incorporate Ukrainian and Eastern European myths with a story, so...
Yes, and the name of that book is Sisters of the Winter Wood by Rena Rosner. And hopefully it won't have a lot of the problematic issues with female characters, seeing as the author is female, but we'll see. Moving on.
So I'm going to review The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Unlike Serge, I'm going to review a book that I actually really enjoyed. It's a beautifully written book about a girl coming to terms with her mother's suicide, and it actually uses magical realism as the way to explore the girl, Lee, her grief, and also her complicated family history. So this book looks at how suicide affects the people left behind, but it also shows the slow recovery to normalcy for the people, the family members of whoever committed suicide. This book has one of my favorite openings of any book I've read recently. My mother is a bird. This isn't like some William Faulkner stream of consciousness metaphorical crap.
Yes, that is the one chapter I remember from As I Lay Dying.
By William Faulkner. That is actually a hilarious Faulkner chapter.
Except in Faulkner, she was a fish, so that's actually very different from a bird, I'll have you know.
Exactly. This book takes place after the suicide, before the suicide, and even before the mother's birth. So timeline-wise, it's all over the place, but never once is it confusing. This actually lends itself to the exploration of the characters and their lives and the family dynamic that really lets you know everything you need to know. And at one point, Lee does end up going to Taiwan to learn more about her estranged grandparents and about her mom's life prior to immigrating to the US. Lee had no communication with this set of grandparents. She has very little understanding of her mother's life. It's kind of sad how isolated she was, and she doesn't speak much Taiwanese or Mandarin or anything, so she really struggles to speak to her grandparents to learn more about not only her grandparents, but her mother. And it's actually really touching and really sad. This part, in particular, is actually beautifully done. It's relatable in a way.
In what way are you able to relate to that?
Don't we all wish we knew more about our parents and our families and our histories and our family histories? And it's always like a difficult topic to broach, just in general.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I never find the right way to ask my parents anything about my family, and I definitely wish I'd talked to my grandfather more before he passed away.
And also, I guess because, I come from an immigrant family, so even though I do speak Mandarin decently, it's always difficult. There's always that language barrier that no matter what I ask, they assume that I don't know what I'm asking, so they don't necessarily answer the questions that I have. So for Lee, who doesn't even speak the language, trying to ask these questions, it just doesn't really get anywhere. I guess that's why I find it relatable. Her whole thing in Taiwan was really, everyone saw her as an American. She is a Hapa, so she looks different from everyone, and everyone talks about her when she was in Taiwan, oh, look at her. She has to be a Hunshier, she has to be mixed blood. Even by the way she dressed, by the way she acted, everyone knew. And I know, whenever I go back, my cousin tells me, you don't look Chinese. You don't even smell Chinese. The way you dress, everyone can tell. Don't even pretend. Why do you bother speaking Chinese to us? So it's one of those things. But it's one of those things, I really felt Lee, and I'll keep talking about this, but I felt that she was relatable not only because of that, but because when she's in the US growing up, she never really felt accepted as one of everyone else, because everyone looked at her and oh, look, you must be something. You're not truly white. And then she goes back to Taiwan. It's you're not Taiwanese. You're something else. As an ABC, you're never accepted. You always get where are you really from? From complete strangers, completely inappropriately. They would just keep asking where are you really from question until your head wants to explode. And then you feel when you go back to a country where you're supposed to be from, where everyone in the country you live in tells you that you have to be from, you go back there and then it becomes, Nah, you're not. I thought her family thing was kind of relatable in that. I feel like her journey in Taiwan was relatable in a way because she is trying to find herself through finding her mom's past. Like most YA books with romances, I did think that the romance was the weakest part of this book. I didn't hate it. I've hated YA romances in books. This one wasn't the worst thing ever, but when something has an element that's so strong, the finding herself, finding her true identity, finding her family, past family history, just learning about her family, I thought that was so strong that the whole romance kind of took away from it, even though it was sort of important for her character.
Yeah, you almost feel like, why didn't the author just not have that in there and just focus on the other aspect?
I understand that her friendship with the guy was important, but I didn't really care as much as I cared about her mom.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that happens. If you think about real life, you look at somebody's story, there's going to be something in it that's relatable that you're going to be interested in, but they're actually living their own life, and they have their own wants and needs.
This book does have a magical realism aspect. I do know that magical realism can rub people the wrong way. It stands with any book in this genre. There's always going to be a part where the story was great, but why did it have to have like this magical thing? If it just stayed real, it could have been more powerful, etc., etc.
Why was there a mermaid? It would have been fine without the mermaids.
How this book does it is it takes a lot of things that people who understand the culture would like, and it also takes a lot from the characters themselves. Lee is an artist, so there's a lot of art magical realism that fits into it, music magical realism, like it all comes together, it all fits together. I know my first reaction was, ugh, magical realism, but once magical realism, when it works, and when it doesn't work, you hate it. And this was a situation where it worked perfectly, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. Wow. It was a fantastic read. The only way you're not going to like it is if magical realism is just not your cup of tea. If it's not your cup of tea, do not read this book. And also, the romance thing is a little iffy. Otherwise, it's about coming to terms with a sudden loss and coming to terms with having someone with mental illness in your family. And it's coming to terms with family issues and overcoming problems in your family and trying your best to, making a new foundation for you and the people who are left behind.
Well, I can't wait until I have a book that I can give 5 stars, because I feel like I've been just giving one cruddy review after another. It'll come soon, I think. I'm still reading that Myths of the Caucasus book, and that one's headed towards a solid 5 out of 5, and I will finish it probably sometime this year.
Didn't you just finish a book that you spent 2 days laughing your head off?
Yeah, I did. It was funny, but it's not a 5 out of 5 funny.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Well, you guys will hear about that book in our next episode, so...
Yeah, alright. You know what? Enough dilly-dallying. Let's get to what you guys are all really here for.
Otherwise, you're going to feel so betrayed that you were just listening for nothing.
Ooh, betrayal. Alright, speaking of betrayal, after this interlude, we are finally going to discuss the first of the Fear Street Saga series.
The Fear Street Saga. The Betrayal.
Dun dun dun.
We'll see you guys after the break.
And we're back.
Let's start off with our prediction accuracy.
Okay, yeah, so first of all, I said that the book would be about the burning of Fear Mansion, that the murder weapon will be a blend of fire and witchcraft. So I'm okay so far, but then I said the murderer is female, and that is not the case. I also said the victim will be female, which is fine. There are female victims here. And I said that Fear's daughters will end up dead in this book. It doesn't really say anything about that. I guess the entire Fier family is supposed to be burning up in their mansion, but it's not specifically mentioned who those family members are, so not the worst prediction accuracy I've ever had, but not great.
Alright, so my predictions were that it was going to involve the Fier family, and the fire is Simon Fier's house burning down. And that was right. I said there will be witchcraft. I said the murder weapon will be fire, and people will meet a fiery death.
That's accurate.
I said the murderer would be female, which was incorrect. I said the murder victim would be male, which, like you said, there were multiple bodies, and, one of the victims was indeed male. And I said there was actually going to be a few dead bodies, and that was pretty true as well.
I think we did okay this time around, both of us. But that cover kind of gives everything away, plus we've already read so much about the Fier family history. There wasn't really any way we could have gotten it.
Plot synopsis.
Just to wrap it up succinctly, the book flashes back and forth between Nora Goode, in the sort of the present day of the book, is witnessing the Fier mansion burning down in the year 1900. Meanwhile, in late 1600s New England, we have the newly immigrated Fier, maybe?
Fier.
Brothers, who are a successful Puritan family in the small town of Wickham. But all is not as it seems with the Fiers, who seem to be caught up in the middle of the Salem witch trial hysteria, which is sweeping the region at that time. The story details the original sin of the Fier family and the multi-generational cycle of revenge that is triggered by it.
One major thing that you forgot is that it's not just the Fier family from the 1600s, it's also the Goode family, and they're intertwined.
So let's get right to the goods.
Well, they're a Puritan family, and Puritans believe in modesty and pureness. So you have Nora Goode, who's the main narrator. She wears a special amulet given to her by Daniel Fier as a token of his love. And remember that this is in 1900.
Would immediately flash back to like 1692 or something, where we have Martha and William Goode, who are husband and wife, and they're poor. They live in like this crappy, poor Puritan village. They don't have a lot of food to put on the table. They're struggling with their crop.
They have a baby, George, and they have an older daughter, Susanna Goode. She's 16 years old, tall and thin. She has long golden curls, sparkling blue eyes, creamy pale skin, and dimples in both cheeks. And she likes staring at her reflection a lot, which kind of irks her mom because Puritans don't believe in that sort of thing, supposedly.
Right, but she's a teenager, and it's a Fear Street book, so you're going to have teenager stuff.
She's in love and having a secret affair with Edward Fier,
which is going to end up being problematic, as we'll see. And finally, we have Jeremy Thorne, and you may think to yourself, wait a second, I thought we were doing the goods right now. We'll give you the goods on Jeremy in a little bit, but for now, let's just say that he has sparkling blue eyes, heavy blonde eyebrows, and wavy blonde hair.
We're finally getting to the Fier family, and that's Fier, by the way.
Fier.
Fier.
We think they might be French because it says that they did not come from England, and I did a little research on the name. It is an English name. It's originally of Norman origin, and the Normans came from France. So it's conceivable there's a couple of Fiers left over on the mainland.
Well, they came from a small farm village, wherever they're from, and they were very, very poor, really struggled, but really came to Wickham and prospered.
Yes.
And it's believed by a lot of the people in Wickham that they're a prosperous family because they are the most worthy. Good fortune goes to those who are the most righteous.
To begin with, we have Benjamin Fier, who is the most powerful and wealthy man in Wickham. This is the part where it gets a little weird. It is 1692, and Wickham has caught the witch trial bug. We've all heard about Salem, Massachusetts. But...
You mean they got the spell?
Ooh. Yes. Salem was not the only town that was prosecuting witches at the time. The thing kind of spread to some neighboring towns as well. And Wickham, apparently, is one of those towns. So Benjamin Fier, being the town magistrate, is actually the one that presides over all of these witch trials.
Well, what's interesting is that he insists the women who are guilty be burned rather than hanged as they are elsewhere in Massachusetts.
His wife's name is Margaret, and he is the father of Edward Fier.
Edward Fier is tall and good-looking with straight dark brown hair and eyes. He's 17th century dapper, and what I mean by that is he really cares about what he wears and how he wears it.
He eventually ends up marrying somebody named Rebecca, who is described as having straight black hair, olive eyes, and dramatic dark lips.
They have a son, Ezra, who is a difficult child and who acts younger than his age. And we just want to say that a lot of the characters we're introducing, they do come at different points in the story. So even though we're at 1692 Wickham, we also jump a little further in time after that and a little further after that. In the Wickham part of things, Rebecca and Ezra aren't around.
Right, exactly. So in the Wickham part of things, Edward is still a teenager. And then later on, when he marries Rebecca and has Ezra, he's a 20-something.
Okay, now you got Matthew Fier. He has a farm that prospers when others fail because he is more righteous and more faithful than any other farmers. He's Benjamin's younger brother.
And he's got the biggest carrots in town. We'll get more into that later. He's married to Constance, and his daughter is Mary Fier, who was actually born after the Fiers leave Wickham. But before we move on, I just want to mention that he does have this one prized possession, And that is that silver amulet that we already talked about being on the cover of the book. If you recall in a previous episode when we described the cover of this book.
So it's described as a silver disc that sparkled with blue jewels that were grasped by a silver three-toed claw. And inscribed on the back were 3 Latin words, Dominatio per malum. So this is a super serious episode because we are in the saga. So we told everyone who wanted to put an ad in this episode, no, we need to talk about the mythology of Fear Street. No ads.
No distractions. We're just going to deep dive right into the in-depth plot and the mythology because this is serious, folks. This is the culmination of what we've been working up to for the last year and a half. Let's do this. So first of all, let's start with 1900. That's where the book starts. That's where we're going to start. We all saw the picture on the cover and we were like, okay, it's going to be the Fier mansion fire. And sure enough, it is. And we have an eyewitness. It's Nora Goode. And we don't know the significance of her name yet, but we will soon find out as we keep reading.
So Nora witnesses the burning down of Fier mansion. She has a negative reaction, but all of a sudden she sort of wakes up and she's in a room and suddenly she becomes like Bilbo Baggins.
Basically, she's writing down the story of the blood rivalry between the two families.
We start with 1692, Wickham Village in Massachusetts Colony.
We're in the Goode household now. We get like a little snapshot of life as it was in the colonies. We find out that Susanna and Edward are having a secret affair. They're kind of meeting in the woods, even though they're not supposed to be, because you're supposed to have a chaperone when you meet somebody of the opposite sex and you're their age.
Well, also, they think that the woods has what they call the evil one. Whatever is possessing these poor women in the village, it's sort of in the woods.
She goes in the woods to meet him, but she's also like really scared, because she's like, oh no, what if the evil one grabs me or whatever?
Well, one of her best friends was actually accused and burned of witchcraft, so...
She's very happy to be with Edward, and they kind of pledge themselves to each other. She's all happy about that, but later on that night, her father basically warns her, hey, don't hang out with Edward. Don't you know that he's actually going to marry this other girl? His father told me himself.
Apparently, Benjamin Fier has arranged for Edward to marry this woman named Anne Ward. She's the daughter of August Ward, an important tea importer in Portsmouth. This marriage is going to help with their status and financial situation, as marriages were back in the day.
So Susanna's really pissed off. She thinks that Ed lied to her, but he actually didn't. He didn't know about this marriage either. He finds out that same night that she does from her father. His father tells him about it.
And he is actually really upset. And he tells his dad, no, I want to marry Susanna. I'm in love with her. And if forced to, he will run away and marry her and leave the family.
And this is the first that his father is hearing of his love for Susanna. He's kind of like, what? We'll see about that.
Yeah, basically, he responds in a way that the town magistrate could react.
The thing about this was, like, Edward is so oblivious to this. He's like, oh, I stood up to my dad. Now everything's going to be fine. I'm so glad I'm going to marry Susanna.
Turns out, next day, knock, knock, knock on the Goode's door.
Benjamin busts into the house with some bailiffs or whatever. Susanna and her mother are accused of witchcraft and dragged off to jail. The witchcraft trial is just a total kangaroo court, and they're pretty much sentenced to burn. They like released a bat, and the bat flew around the courthouse, and they were like, oh my goodness, it's the devil.
And there was another part where the wind blew in through the window, and it like made the torches flicker, and they're like, oh, your witchcraft is trying to blow out our lights.
Yeah, it was like so ridiculous.
Well, the entire time, Susanna's looking out at the people at the courthouse, and she's like, where's Edward? Why isn't Edward here? So later, after they're dragged off to their cell, Edward finally comes.
Edward shows up at the jail cell, and he tells Susanna he can't believe that he was tempted and strung along by a witch. And he's like genuinely upset at her. And it seems like he's been completely hoodwinked by his father's deception and lies about this whole witchcraft thing.
After all, the court decided that she was a witch, and the court was his dad, and his dad would never hurt him purposefully, so she must be a witch, because he knew that Edward loved Susanna.
It's so frustrating. This guy is so dumb. Honestly, it must be like really frustrating to his dad too, to know that his son is like such a dunce. But whatever.
That night, Matthew Fier shows up at William Goode's house, and he says that for £100, Martha and Susanna will be freed.
William Goode is not a wealthy man, and all he has is like £80 that he's saved up from England, and he's sort of kept in a box this whole time. He's saving for later instead of feeding his family.
And if he gives that £80, he would be left with just a couple of shillings.
whatever, I guess out of the generosity of his heart, Matthew's like, all right, fine, I'll accept the 80 pounds.
Well, he also takes like the super expensive family brass skillet or something.
Yeah, he basically robs the man blind. But during the exchange of money, William notices that Matthew's amulet is kind of like hanging off of his neck, and he comments on the fact that there's these chicken leg claws holding the jewels, and that they're the demon's claws, and it's like a symbol of some kind of demonic power.
Matthew Fier wants nothing to do with this conversation. He was like, I don't know what you're talking about, and you shouldn't be talking about this, so give me your crap and I'm gonna go.
But that clearly spooks the Fier family.
Well, yeah, Matthew Fier was shook.
Yeah, how does this guy know about this? Did we just mess with the wrong family?
Well, burning days here.
They're piling up the wood to burn the witches.
And William Goode's like, wait, what's going on? Hasn't Matthew Fier told you they're not supposed to be burned anymore?
But no, Matthew never told anyone any such thing. In fact, both he and his older brother have skipped town, looted the town storehouse with all the food supplies for the winter, cleared it out.
Yeah, screwed over the town.
Grabbed a bunch of wagons and just pieced out with their whole family and the money from William Goode. They're gone.
And the women burn.
The sentence is still carried out, even though Benjamin Fier proves himself to be a complete fraud and charlatan by just escaping town. Why would you accept his sentence and his ruling in this case? Especially since a lot of the townfolk already suspect that, wait a second, some of these people that have been accused of being witches are good, honest folk. We don't get this. Why continue to carry on the sentence? I really don't get it. It's just baffling to me. But anyway, it happens.
Well, mob mentality rules. The mob wanted a fire.
Right, and William watches his daughter and his wife burn to death. It's like a really sad scene. After the burning, William rushes home to reveal he's a wizard. So it turns out, yeah, he was the wrong guy to mess with. So now it's like, what's that movie with Keanu Reeves?
John Wick? Are you comparing his wife and daughter to John Wick's dog?
Yes, correct. William Goode from Wickham. Coincidence? I think not. Is actually John Wick. He's given up his life of witchcraft, laid it to rest, buried all the gold coins in his basement, and laid a bunch of concrete over it. And he's moved on, and now he has a wife and a daughter. But now he's forced to go back to his old ways because his wife and daughter had been taken away from him. The whole Baba Yaga thing from John Wick is very appropriate because it turns out this guy is the Baba Yaga. This guy is somebody you do not want to mess with. A powerful wizard who will mess up your day, and now he's enraged and has just one purpose in life.
Innocents died today, but my hatred will live for generations. The Fiers shall not escape me. Wherever they flee, I will be there. My family's screams shall become the Fiers' tortured screams. The fire that burned today will not be quenched until revenge is mine, and the Fiers burn forever in the fire of my curse.
Yeah, they messed with the wrong guy.
Flash forward, Western Pennsylvania, 1710.
Now, it's 18 years later, and the Fiers are once again successful. They've uprooted, taken most of the supplies of a New England village, along with 100 pounds or so of plus whatever they had saved up, and plonked down somewhere on the frontier in Western Pennsylvania. They have a big farm where they all live and are the most prosperous family in their village.
Obviously, after 18 years, things have changed in the family. Like we said before, you got Rebecca, Ezra, Mary, etc., etc. They weren't around in Wickham, but they're here now.
We got this family scene where, while they're enjoying a nice family dinner, during which the cantankerous old Benjamin Fier keeps talking about how the family is cursed, you discover that William Goode has finally tracked them down after almost 20 years. Turns out, Benjamin was onto something when he was talking about being cursed. It may not seem it, right? They had almost 20 years of a run of success, but all of their bad juju's about to catch up to them.
Yeah, you actually see a string of bad luck. During that family scene, Edward's like, something's up with the roof. I'm gonna go fix it. Someone's like, no, it's too dark. You shouldn't do it. He's like, no, I'm gonna do it now. So he goes out to check on the roof, and what happens?
He falls off. Because it's been raining and it's slippery. He just slides right off and breaks his arm.
And while he falls, he causes such a ruckus that Constance is busy doing something with a knife, and she ends up slicing herself wide open.
Bleeding all over the place.
First two things that happen that are horrible for the family.
But then, something that's not so horrible, Mary bumps into this guy called Jeremy. He's wandered onto her family farm, and he is trying to get a job working for them.
His family apparently just moved to town. His dad is just too old and too ill, and he needs to make money for his family.
So at first, Matthew refuses, But Edward intervenes and he's like, Uncle, I got a broken arm. I can't really help around the farm like I used to be able to, so we actually do need to take on a little extra help. An odd coincidence, don't you think?
Mary is certainly happy that this happened because Jeremy's a good-looking chap. He loves doing work without his shirt on. Obviously, they get a little close.
Yeah, I'm like imagining the cover of a Harlequin romance novel at this point.
Well, what's really hilarious, I thought, for this part of the book was, at one point she goes, he's really good looking. And it's like, come on, R.L. Stine. How come your 1700s characters and your 1990s characters say the exact same thing?
Well, teens will be teens. I mean, like, just read Romeo and Juliet, right?
Yeah, I don't think Shakespeare...
Romeo doth look cute today.
This little bit of good luck with this Jeremy kid doesn't last very long, because you got more bad crap happening.
It goes beyond flirting, right? The two kids, their romantic relationship actually gets to the point of, I want you to tell your parents about me, because these guys are still, like, religious, so they're not gonna bang unless they're, like, married or something.
But they already made out.
Maybe that's allowed. So now...
all their hardcore necking and, like, breaking of the puritanical rules brings along more bad luck for the Fier family. Really, you could just blame it all on Mary.
So Benjamin is found just knocked out cold, unresponsive on the floor, and when he finally comes to, he has no feeling in his left leg, and then later his left arm, and then his right arm. He's growing more and more paralyzed by the minute.
I mean, we condensed this. It happens over days where he has issues with his left leg, and then a few days later it's his left arm, and then all of a sudden a few days later it's the right leg.
I mean, things are tough, but they're all trying to soldier through. I mean, this is the frontier. Stuff happens, and Benjamin's getting on in his years, so, it could be just one of those things.
Well, one day, Edward and Mary go on a walk in the woods, and all of a sudden the woods are just on fire.
And in the fire, they see a woman tied to a post, being burned alive.
Edward takes one look, and he recognizes her as Susanna Goode. He freaks out, and all of a sudden the vision just disappears.
That should tell him that something's up, but I don't know. What happens now?
Edward completely changes as a person. He gets really quiet, doesn't want to talk about it. They tell Matthew and Benjamin, and everyone's like a little off. Everyone's like really different, and Mary's like, what? What's going on? Because she wasn't around for this.
She's Matthew's daughter, so she was born after they already fled Wickham, so she doesn't know about all the crap that went down.
And then one day, Mary wants to go over to Edward's house just to see how he's doing. The family's just being so weird, and she was like, whatever, my parents are acting weird, and I'm just gonna make sure, like, Edward and, his are okay. And she walks in, and she finds that Rebecca, Edward's wife, she's hanged herself. And actually, this is a really graphically written scene.
Yeah, and I think this all takes place during, like, a raging thunderstorm. And so it's, like, pouring down freaking, like, cats and dogs. She runs out of the house in terror into the grassy pasture, and she, like, runs right into a scarecrow. Except it's not a scarecrow.
It's Benjamin Fier's body propped into a scarecrow-like thing.
And he's dead. There's like a dead Benjamin Fier scarecrow, and Edward Fier's wife has hanged herself.
Matthew's response to these deaths is just basically locking himself in the bedroom and chanting the inscription on the amulet.
His daughter is like, what is my dad doing?
And also she's traumatized because she found the two bodies.
So her family's like totally messed up right now. So her dad is just chanting Latin like to himself, locked in his room. And her cousin's wife just killed herself. Her uncle is dead and she saw his dead body. Like she found both dead bodies.
At the funeral for Rebecca and Benjamin, Jeremy reveals to Mary that his father's the one that killed the two Fiers. So he tells Mary the story of what happened in Wickham in 1692 from the Goode's family point of view. And he also said that his brother George had returned to Wickham because he couldn't handle their father's insane obsession. The reason that he's telling her the story is because he loves her. And if the two of them get married, it'll end this blood curse between the two families. And he didn't tell her he was a Goode because he knew that Matthew Fier would never give him a job if he knew that he was a Goode.
So this story from her point of view checks out because she's desperate to hold on to the one thing she has in her life right now that isn't completely messed up. And also it's got this aspect of not only is this the only person in her life right now that isn't dead or crazy, she can also, by joining with him in holy matrimony, put an end to all the craziness that's going on with her family. This is like the life vest, the little life preserver that she wants to grab onto right now as she's drowning.
Edward overhears this conversation and doesn't believe a word of it. His father was a just man after all. Edward actually runs to confront Uncle Matthew, just as Mary runs in to tell her father, Matthew, the news of Jeremy. And Matthew's just like, okay, yes, Edward, the story is true.
Yep, we completely screwed over the goods. Like, we did that. Yeah, that girl that you loved, yeah, your father had her murdered.
Edward and Mary are both completely horrified to hear about their fathers actually being awful human beings.
Yeah.
Matthew's reaction is hilarious. He's like, and now that we know the Goodes are here and they're responsible for the deaths of Rebecca and Benjamin, we must seek revenge.
Yeah, so Edward and Mary are like, the new generation. They're not quite as evil as their uncle/father, so they're like, yeah, how about we try a different tack? The whole kill thing didn't work. Why don't we try to patch things up?
We've killed a few of theirs. They've killed a few of ours. We're even. Mary and Jeremy are in love. It's all good.
It's all good. Let's just do the lovey-dovey thing and put an end to this.
Matthew actually thinks this is a super crap idea, but he's like, whatever. Just do it. If that's what you want, fine.
Finally, the day has come, and Jeremy will meet Matthew Fier to officially be Mary's suitor.
Jeremy walks in to shake hands with Matthew Fier, and then Matthew Fier starts doing his little Latin chants.
Yeah, he grabs the amulet and he starts chanting the inscription
and
like a crazy man.
Pop! Jeremy's head explodes.
This scene, you even mentioned popping sound. It was like kernel of corn popping or something. Oh my god, you just imagine a Mars attacks, blood spraying, mist.
Hidden under the head that just popped is another head.
It's William Goode! Hey, our old friend from Wickham.
Yeah, he was using his powers to stay young.
And he was masquerading as his own son Jeremy, which was not the case. There's no Jeremy.
Matthew just keeps chanting the Latin just over and over again until William Goode crumbles into a pile of powdery gray dust.
All of this happens all at once. Pop turns to dust, Matthew acting like a total freak. Mary sees her dad acting like a total evil wizard. She doesn't understand what's going on. She just keeps asking, "Where's Jeremy? Where's Jeremy?" At this point, Edward realizes that it's time to peace out. He grabs his son Ezra, he grabs Mary, and they leave. And Matthew Fier is just laughing with hysterical peals of laughter.
Constance began pounding her fists on his chest. Stop laughing! Stop laughing! Matthew, can you not stop? Mary, come on! Edward pulled Mary to the door. Ezra, clinging to his father's shoulder, began to cry. Edward pulled Mary out the door into the cool night. Jeremy? Is Jeremy coming with us? Mary demanded. No, Edward told her. Come with me. We have to leave this farm tonight. He pulled her into the darkness. In the house, Constance continued to plead with her husband. Matthew, stop laughing. Stop. Can you stop? Can you stop now? Despite his wife's desperate pleas, Matthew continued to laugh. His round face bright scarlet, his enormous stomach heaving, his mouth gaping open, he laughed and laughed, loud, helpless laughter. Maddened by his triumph, Matthew would laugh without stop for the rest of his life.
Now the original generation of the Fier family has been wiped out. Fast forward another 15 years.
1725, Western Pennsylvania wilderness.
Ezra is a strapping 21-year-old man, and he's only got vague memories of what happened that night back in 1710.
Since then, his father worked himself to the bone and died of exhaustion. Aunt Mary went through phases of either being completely silent or screaming that she's a witch and asking, when's Jeremy coming?
Eventually, she ended up drowning herself in a pond. So now Ezra's basically on his own. He is the final remaining Fier.
Well, he wants to seek revenge on the Goodes for bringing this on his family.
Ezra goes back to the family farm to find out for himself exactly what happened. He wants to see if there's any clues that are still left behind.
He's wondering if Matthew and Constance are still around. And when he gets there, he finds that the house is completely overgrown and dusty, but the thing is, when he goes to check the study, it's completely walled off. And there's a weird scratch sound coming from within the walled-off area.
Right, it's walled off with bricks. You go in the study, and you open the door, there's a box of bricks that's been built inside of it.
So he spends the day unbricking the room. After he does that, he finds 2 skeletons. By the hand of one skeleton is a journal written by Matthew Fier himself.
Turns out that Matthew Fier has walled off the entire room with himself and his wife Constance inside. I'm sure he was laughing maniacally the entire time because he's said to have laughed till the end of his days. And just imagine poor Constance. Like, I don't know how she dealt with that.
He writes in the diary that she doesn't understand what I was doing, so she tried to escape, but I took a stone and smashed her head in. That's how she dealt with it.
Yeah. He just bricked himself in and died.
Ezra is just more radicalized after seeing this, and he wants to seek revenge on the Goodes because they are to blame for everything awful that's happened to his family.
As he's about to leave, Matthew's skeleton falls back, revealing the amulet to Ezra. Ezra takes the amulet, it's his only inheritance, from the Fier family, and he heads out into the night, hell-bent on revenge.
And then we get a nice to be continued.
Yeah, wow. The Goodes almost got everybody, but there's one Fier left alive. We know there's at least one Goode left alive also, so we'll see.
Well, we know that in 1900 there's Nora Goode and Daniel Fier, so yes, obviously there's something happening.
Clearly we're getting into the analysis portion, and this is the Fear Street mythos, right? So the first part of it is Fear Street obviously is named after the Fiers, but did you know that the Fiers used to spell their name differently? This is the big thing. Should be called Fear Street instead. I guess the Fiers changed their name to Fier at some point, just because phonetically, if you sound out F-I-E-R in like the American accent, it's just going to sound exactly like Fier. That makes sense to me. I did a little research on this. It's an English or possibly French name. They do talk about coming from the old country, so that means it's not England. They must be from the French branch of the Fier family. It's a Norman name. They came over during the Norman conquest. It's not a super common name, but you'll find them around. F-I-E-Rs are around. That's a nice little insight into the whole Fier thing. Here's another interesting aspect of it, right? So the word F-I-E-R, Fier, actually does have a meaning in medieval languages. In medieval English, it actually meant companion, friend, or even wife. It's a positive meaning, right? It's somebody that you trust, somebody that you're close to. It's interesting that after the events that transpire here, the spelling of the name and the meaning of the name morphs. As Ezra embarks on his journey of revenge, hatred, and anger to pay back the Goodes for what they did to his family, that name also morphs into F-E-A-R, Fier. It doesn't really have any positive connotations at all. That's an interesting aspect of this whole thing that I think it's helpful to look at.
Well, it looks like Fier is also a French word for trust or proud?
Yes, correct. But the original meaning back in the medieval times was kind of like a friend or companion or wife. Even if you look at the modern French meaning, like you just mentioned, like trust versus fear. If you fear something, then you don't trust it.
But you also have pride comes before the fall.
Mm-hmm.
And it also meant proud. You saw that kind of pride, that actually what brought the curse of the Goodes onto the Fier family.
It's interesting that the Fier family name is actually itself cursed, because it's not the original name. After they were cursed, the name changed, and now the name carries the curse with it. There's a lot to digest here. This is actually one of R.L. Stine's finer moments, I'd have to say.
The Latin on the back of the amulet, dominatio per malum. The translation basically means dominate by means of evil or bad. It's definitely like a horror trope to use Latin as a way to like...
Right, even going back to...
Event Horizon?
Exactly, Event
Liberate
Horizon.
tutime ex inferis.
Infernus, right?
Infernus?
Yeah.
Well, what's hilarious about Event Horizon, which is completely off track, but when they first recorded it, like no one on set knew Latin. They sort of did what they thought was correct, but it ended up being like Italian. So then they had to go to ADR it. And then someone, like an executive, listened to it and was like, that's not Latin. So then they had to ADR it again, like right before release. I think they said, like, it's still not technically correct.
You know, Latin went through so many different forms, because if you think about the history of Rome, started, like 600 BC, and then Rome finally fell, maybe around 600 AD or so. So there were people speaking Latin for 1200 years. There's no way that Latin sounded the same the entire time, right? You just look at the English language, hasn't even been around for 1200 years, and Old English sounds nothing like what I'm speaking today. And Middle English sounds different, and Shakespearean English is barely comprehensible, and that was only 400 years ago. I'm just saying, to all those executives out there who want to nitpick, you don't know that there wasn't some dialect of Latin back then that sounded exactly like whatever the heck they said in Event Horizon. I agree, that is a horror trope. That's a good point.
But I also think it's hilarious. The amulet has the blue jewels. The amulet supposedly came from the old country, and we know about the Fear Street blue deposits.
Right, this is so cool. You're almost thinking like, okay, we know the Fiers end up at Shadyside, living on Fear Street, where there's a huge deposit of the blue clay mineral. You can't help but thinking, like, there's got to be a connection. You got these blue stones in the amulet. Is the amulet guiding the Fiers back to that mother lode of the mineral? And then you've got to be thinking about, like, okay, so how did bits of the mineral make it into the old country? This is where we could go, like, so deep. You know, you could talk about ancient mariners traversing the Atlantic Ocean between the New World and the Old World. Or, if you're thinking about what is the origin of the blue mineral clay deposit, to go back to a movie that recently came out, Black Panther, right? They have this unobtainium type of mineral. What is it called? Vibranium. Yeah, so vibranium, where does it come from? Well, wave your hands around. Long story short, meteor fell to Earth 1 million years ago. Well, what if the blue clay mineral, is the same kind of thing? You got a meteor came to Earth 1 million years ago, whatever. Well, what happens as a mineral enters the Earth's atmosphere? It actually starts to break apart. And so pieces of it can fall elsewhere, away from where the main impact is. In fact, it could have broken apart into like a few different pieces before it even entered the Earth's atmosphere. It could have become broken up by the gravity of the Earth. Parts of it could have fallen in the old world, and part of it could have fallen in America. Maybe the main deposit is in America, and those other pieces all want to come back. Maybe it wants to become reassembled into one whole. What if it's like an alien spaceship that was all composed out of this like blue clay, metal, mineral, whatever the heck it is, and it just wants to reassemble itself, and it's drawing all the bits of itself back in towards itself in order to reassemble? I don't know. There's so many different possibilities you could go here. It could be like there is only one source originally, and then it got distributed, and now it's by chance coming back together. It could be like it was distributed originally, and it's drawing the pieces of it together back to itself. Is it an old meteor that struck the Earth? Who knows?
Or it could be the key to Schwab theory.
It could be. You know what I was thinking about is Wickham, right? If you look at a map today, there is no Wickham in Massachusetts. That's not a thing. And then they talk about how in Wickham they burned the witches. Well, if you look at the history books, the witches weren't burned. And they acknowledge it in this book. They say, well, everywhere else in Massachusetts, they're hanging the witches. But we don't do that. We burn them. So you have to think, is Wickham in like a little alternate reality bubble? Is it like Brigadoon? Remember we talked about when we came up with Schwab theory, that was also the book where they had Brigadoon, which is a village in the Scottish Highlands that only appears once every 100 years because it's walled off by this alternate reality space-time bubble. What if Wickham is like that? What if Wickham is actually the location of the Massachusetts Shadyside, the B site as we call it? There's a lot of possibilities going on here.
I also like that it's Wickham that burns the witches because, what is a wick?
Right, the wick is the part of the candle that burns.
Matthew Fier was obviously using his witchcraft to do their farm stuff. Give them the biggest carrots, give them the biggest potatoes, the best crops. Do you think anyone else in his family knew of what he was doing? Or was it just Matthew Fier?
Maybe Benjamin knew about it. It's not exactly clear. Why did they leave Wickham? I'm thinking it's because Matthew knew that he was busted at that point, and they pieced out. So he must have told Benjamin, because Benjamin must have been in on it if he agreed to uproot the family. They weren't going to leave and just go to Pennsylvania and burn all their ties unless Matthew told Benjamin what was going on.
Were they also doing the safest place to be is by the most dangerous, the famous Pippin quote from Lord of the Rings?
The closer we are to danger, the further we are from harm. It's the last thing they'd expect.
The Fier family was the one actually practicing the witchcraft, and they were the ones inciting all the witchcraft mania.
Oh, right, projection.
Well, not even projection. It's a way to get a tighter hold of the community, A, and B, you're never going to think this just man who is trying to save everyone is going to be, related to...
No, sure.
It's classic authoritarian playbook stuff.
But interestingly enough, they seem to learn their lesson, right? Because in Pennsylvania, they don't try to pull that. Yes, they are the most prominent family in town, but they're also living on the outskirts of town, and they're not attempting to dominate the civic life of the village. And you hear Benjamin's, afraid that their family is cursed. They are truly running away from what they've done. But running away is not the same as atoning for your sins, and their sins catch up to them in the end. Going back to the witchcraft aspect of it, I don't think Benjamin is practicing witchcraft. He may be hoodwinking the townsfolk into believing that there's witches among them and whatever to distract from his brother, but I don't think he himself is doing it. I think it's just Matthew.
If William Goode had not called out the amulet, do you think they would have actually let Susanna and Martha go?
Maybe. I think they might have.
And do you think he was doing deals the entire time?
Everybody else burned, so I don't know. Either everybody else didn't have the money.
Well, you only heard about the girls that burned.
Right.
So do you think there were girls that didn't burn because their family did have the money?
Could be.
Or why was he driven to, like, help the Goodes?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's really confusing, right? Like, maybe that was the first time he did it. Maybe he thought the whole aspect was messed up of how Susanna was accused of being a witch simply because it was not conducive to the marriage plans that Benjamin had for his son. So maybe this was the first time that he had gone rogue and tried to do that. Maybe they had quote-unquote legitimate evidence of witchcraft for the other witches. And this was, like, the first really sham one that he, like, didn't agree with. There was an interesting little tidbit earlier when William Goode is talking to his wife, Martha. She was like, why are our carrots so small, right? They're having a meal of some porridge and really cruddy bread and some really tiny carrots that he grew in his garden. And she's like, well, you know, Matthew's carrots are the biggest in town.
William says at that point, we could have big carrots if I really wanted to, or something like that.
I know how to make big carrots also. And I'm wondering, okay, obviously he is a real practitioner of the dark arts, although he's forsworn it, like the John Wick storyline, and he's buried it down deep, and he's like, I'm a reformed man now, don't do that anymore. He's trying his best to come by his carrots honestly. And so as a result, growing in that cruddy, sandy New England soil, they're not that great. But it's almost like he's beginning to already suspect at that point that something's going on with Matthew. And then as soon as he sees that amulet, he knows what's going on.
Well, he should have shut his mouth and not said anything if he knew what it represented. Matthew did have a good point. Like, you should know what this is. I certainly don't know what it means, so shut your mouth. So, that was, like, really dumb of him to, like, actually say something because his wife and daughter's lives are on the line. And B, his wife and daughter's lives are on the line. Just don't say anything. Say it afterwards, after they're free.
Yeah, that's true. He's very innocent. He trusts that there's good in everybody, and even as he's being completely, like, swindled, extorted for money, he, like, still doesn't quite see it that way. He still sees it in a positive light, like, I'm finally gonna get my wife and daughter back. He's kind of a broken man already at this point, and so he's not really watching what he says very carefully. I kind of get it.
Also, going back to the name Fear, isn't that four in German?
Yes, it is. And then we also remember from the first book in the Fear Street series, the new girl actually lives at 444 Fear Street, which is Fear Street, or Fierstrasse, if you want to go full German. And I looked into this. Maybe it's a German name. As far as I can tell, it's not a German name. It's French and English, but yeah, that's a good point.
I was just trying to figure out the significance of maybe the number 4.
Right, and you had mentioned that 4 signifies death in Chinese culture.
Well, in Chinese culture, but in Mandarin, yes.
Yes.
And the Fear certainly had a lot of death.
That's really interesting how this ties right back into the beginning of the book series, how all of this was foreshadowed right from the beginning. You kind of wonder if R.L. Stine had this all plotted out in his mind. We're in like 1994 right now. That's nuts that back in 89 he was already thinking about how this would all go down. I mean, the Fear Street Mansion fire is mentioned in that first book already. So this is really bringing everything together. I'm really excited about the next 2 books in this saga series because this is really like the heart of the matter.
Well, another thing is Fear, F-I-E-R. Just rearrange the letters, F-I-R-E.
Wow. It's an anagram for fire. I didn't even think of that. There's like so many different ways to approach this. It's amazing. Sadly, changing their name to something that isn't an anagram for fire did not prevent the tragic Fear Mansion fire of 1900.
I mean, it just never stops following them, right?
No.
If you rearrange the Fear that's as it's spelled here, you get fire, right? And they were the only place, the Massachusetts colonies, that burned their witches. And then the image of that burning is what follows their family forever. You see it in the Fear Street Mansion burning. You saw it in the vision in the woods. Fire has such deep meaning to the Fear family. They're never escaping that fire.
Yep, that's true. I'm trying to remember the modern day Fears. Party Summer, we have a Fear, and I don't recall if he had any fire-related things. I don't think he did.
Well, I'm actually thinking about Simon Fear and what he was known for, but for some reason, the only thing I could think about when I think Simon Fear and whatever like he was doing is I'm just conflating it with the guy from Meddling Kids. And I don't know why. I can't think of Simon Fear without thinking Meddling Kids. It's a great book, by the way. It's out in paperback.
Oh my god, and that makes sense too, right? Because in Meddling Kids, he was actually...
Spoilers.
Oh, yeah, we shouldn't go into this. Really, the Fier family story, as we see it in the Fear Street Saga, meshes pretty well with the Meddling Kids storyline about the main baddie. As we can see, the mythos is once again blown wide open here in this book. We knew coming in that this would be amazing, and it really is. I mean, I rattled off 20 different theories in the span of a minute, and it could be any one of these.
Another thing I want to say is, we don't really have anything on the Goode family in modern day Fear Street.
We don't have the goods on the goods?
No, we don't. And what I think is interesting is, we do know that the corporation comes later. Maybe they have a good CEO.
Oh my god. Maybe the corporation was founded by the Goodes. We already know about the three basic opposing forces of Fear Street, which is the ancient local evil that has been fostered around the area, and then the Fears, and then the corporation. What if the corporation actually grew out of the Goodes? Maybe we're going to find out later on in the next two Fear Street Saga books. This could be amazing. We don't really have any callbacks in this book, other than the mention of the Fear Mansion fire, which has been mentioned in pretty much half of the Fear Street books so far.
Yeah, and we don't really have 90s things because it's not the 90s, but we do have...
colonial things. That's right, folks. We are looking at a book that is set almost entirely in the colonial era. This is before the American Revolution, and this is some old stuff here, so let's get into it.
1692, which is when the whole Wickham thing takes place, is also the beginning of the Salem witch trials. We are actually immediately introduced to this fact when the book starts, because there are witch burnings happening in Wickham.
Right. One of the first things that is mentioned in this book, on the very first page of the 1692 section, they refer to a room in the house, which is called a borning room. B-O-R-N-I-N-G room. And I had to look this up, and apparently this is a room that is close to the fireplace or hearth of the house, and it is nice and warm. It's a small warm chamber where a mother gives birth. It's also where the mother, when she's late in her pregnancy, may sleep. It's also where the mother and the newborn child will live for the first month or so. And you can also keep sick folk there, like if you're old and sick, you could go there to recover from your cold or your flu or whatever. So that's something new I learned. I didn't know about boarding rooms.
They also use bake kettles, and that's basically their way of saying a Dutch oven.
So at first I googled bake kettle, and the only thing I came up with is potato chips. Because
Very
everything's
good.
kettle baked these days, right? But it turns out, yeah, it's just a New England way of saying Dutch oven. Maybe it's because the Dutch originally colonized New York. I'm not sure. But it happened. So, like, I guess in the Mid-Atlantic region, it's more like a Dutch oven thing. And in New England, it's more like a bake kettle. And who knows what they call it in the South. Maybe you guys can tell us. Pounds and shillings is currency. When William Goode gets cleaned out, taken to the cleaners by Matthew Fier, he gives him 80 pounds, and he says he's only going to have a few shillings left. And, okay, this is British currency, right? You think, okay, yeah, the American colonies, being British colonies, would use British currency, but the fact of the matter is we had such a huge trade imbalance with the English mainland that there actually wasn't a lot of currency in circulation in America. Again, going back to the trade imbalance, we were importing more stuff from England than we were sending back, so we would have to pay for the goods from England.
But the thing is, William Goode said that he brought the money from England. He literally brought this 80 pounds with him. This is all the money that he had brought over, so it makes sense that it would be in pounds. What doesn't make sense is that Matthew Fier would think to ask him for the pounds.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. Why did he hold on to all that money for so long when his family's nearly starving? That's more of a nitpick. I guess what I'm trying to say is I did some research, and apparently Spanish dollars were a more common form of currency, and even more common than that were paper notes issued by each colony, and they were basically a promissory note. Like, for example, in Virginia, you'd have a bunch of tobacco in a warehouse, and you'd get a note from that warehouse. This many pounds of tobacco, and then you could use that note as currency. In other states, they had notes that were backed up by property value. You'd basically mortgage off your property, you get some paper money based on that, and if you couldn't pay it back, then the state would then own your property. And then because there was so much land in the colonies as they expanded westwards, land became the backing for the paper currencies that sprang up in the different colonies. That was interesting, and it was like a little interesting Wikipedia tunnel that I went down because of reading this book, so I learned something new.
Very rare for a Fear Street book.
Yeah.
I think that's our colonial things section, so I can actually transition us over to nitpicks, because you actually had a nitpick of, well, if he had the 80 pounds that he brought over from the old country, from England, and his family wasn't doing well necessarily, like, why didn't he use the money? I mean, it's the same as, why didn't he just use his magic to make the carrots bigger, or give them more food, or whatever?
He was a bad husband?
Or he knew rainy day funds should be used for rainy days. They weren't starving, they weren't poor, they just weren't well-to-do. Mm-hmm. They were getting by, and they could get by without that money being used. They could get by without his magic.
Right. Well, they didn't get by. They ended up dying, so...
Well, he used his money, and it still didn't work. That's the thing. But one nitpick I had, which also is sort of colonial things, I guess, is that R.L. Stine keeps referring to them as Mr. and Mrs. throughout the entire Wickham section. In our English classes, in 10th grade English, I remember this, we had to read The Crucible and Young Goodman Brown. They went by Goody and Goodman in the Puritan places. So it would actually be like Goodman Good and Goody Good, and Goodman Fier and Goody Fier, and all that good stuff. And I just thought it was funny, like, it could be because R.L. Stine didn't do that sort of research.
But then he knows about a boarding room, so clearly he did some research.
Or it could just be Goodman Good. It's sort of like Major. Like, unless you're writing Catch-22.
Major.
Major.
Okay, so let's break it down a little bit more and get into a little bit of a more in-depth literary analysis with our in-depth thoughts and rating of the book.
This book is obviously a revenge book. We looked up revenge motifs, things that you see in a lot of revenge books.
One of them we already discussed, which is the John Wick motif of my something, wife, daughter, dog has been killed, and now I have nothing left to live for other than to take revenge on that, and I have to dig up my old skills and use them.
Or the classic, my uncle killed my dad.
Hamlet?
When you look up revenge motif, Hamlet is the number one thing that pops up.
Right. Also, Titus Andronicus comes up a lot as well, going back to Shakespeare.
Well, also Count of Monte Cristo.
Yes, Count of Monte Cristo, or The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. Let's go into these themes. The first motif that commonly occurs in revenge stories is a masquerade followed by an unmasking.
In this book, you have William Goode masquerading as Jeremy Thorne, and then Jeremy Thorne's head explodes, revealing William Goode.
This masquerade theme, if you want to think like, okay, what other stories does this show up in? Well, one good example, like I mentioned earlier, is Titus Andronicus. A lot of the main characters at one point masquerading as personifications of revenge and things like that. If you look at Cask of Amontillado, they're actually coming from the carnival where everybody's masquerading. They're already a little bit tipsy after the celebrations. They're still wearing their costumes and getup. That is actually a very common theme in revenge stories. Another thing that shows up a lot in revenge-themed stories is bodily fluids. I guess it's involved in like the deaths, gory descriptions of the death scenes. Did we really see that in this book? It's kind of like a young adult book. Maybe they wouldn't get too gory on this.
Well, the discovery of Rebecca, I don't think there are any bodily fluids being described, but that was pretty graphic.
Another common motif is dramatic irony. It's used in order to intensify the tragic events that are going to unfold by creating tension between the audience and the action of the characters.
In this book, it was quite obvious that Jeremy Thorne, first of all, was a good. And then, second of all, the audience is thinking, oh, it must be the younger brother of Susanna. But then, as soon as Jeremy reveals, my brother, George...
He left because he didn't want to be a part of this whole thing.
You know immediately, okay, this is William Goode. And as the audience, you know something these characters do not know.
Yeah, or also the aspect of how Edward doesn't seem to understand his father's true motivation for accusing and then convicting Susanna of being a witch. And then he goes to Susanna's jail cell and accuses her of hurting him by being a witch this whole time and lying to him. That, like, some dramatic irony right there for sure.
And there's also the dramatic irony in the fact that Edward and Mary and the younger generation, they literally don't know anything that happened in Wickham between the older generation. None of them know that Matthew has that amulet and he is probably a practitioner of the dark arts. The younger generation doesn't know anything about what the older generation did, and they don't know what they're capable of.
And especially Ezra, because while Edward and Mary kind of figure it out, Mary goes crazy and Edward works himself to death because now they're living further out on the frontier and life is hard. So Ezra grows up literally without any of this knowledge and decides to swear revenge, starting with not really fully understanding the situation. It's probably better for him to just leave it alone at this point. And he's just going to get himself into more trouble. I think probably if Ezra had just walked away, it may have all just died down at that point.
Well, what's hilarious is that Edward and Mary both wanted this whole thing to come to an end. The first generation starts this whole thing. The second generation's like, guys, come on, let's be calm and reasonable and rational. Let's end this. They get screwed over by the first generation. They end up dying. And then the next generation, poor Ezra, doesn't know his dad and his aunt wanted this to end already. So he only gets this hatred and this anger. It goes all to him. And it's really sad and ironic that his dad wanted this to end. It could have just ended if he didn't do anything.
Although this isn't necessarily a very common motif, one thing that this story shares with Cask of Amontillado is the part of the story where Matthew walls himself in with bricks along with his dead wife, who he murders. And of course, if you look up Cask of Amontillado, you'll know that it ends with a character getting bricked in alive. That's a shared motif there with a very well-known revenge story.
The last motif that we have is that there are recurrent violent murders that take place throughout the text, especially in the final act or the final scene. The root of the violence, I'm quoting Wikipedia here, the root of the violence is usually derived from the character's childhood development. The violence that we see is not necessarily from the childhood violence, but we do have some violent murders that happen. You have a lot of deaths, and by the last act of the book, you have the death of William Goode, and then you have the walling in and death of Constance and Matthew. You have the death of Edward, and you have the suicide of Mary. You know, some of them aren't necessarily violent, but some of them are murders, and there's a lot of death. But the interesting thing is, the root of the violence is usually derived from the character's childhood development. That's Ezra. Is to be continued. We're going to have another book.
Another theme I think that often runs through revenge stories is sex or sexuality. I guarantee you, if this wasn't a PG-13 book that R.L. Stine was writing, that tension between Susanna and Edward in the beginning would have resulted in possibly a steamy scene, which would have made the betrayal later so much more effective.
I don't think that the Susanna-Edward sex scene would have done much, but I do think that Mary and Jeremy would have been the big one. I think that was a more significant reveal.
Right. I feel like the earlier one would have foreshadowed, reinforced the second one. You'd have the role reversals where you have the Goodes going from the feminine gender to the male gender and taking the power role in the relationship. And it would have been an interesting foreshadowing to the way the revenge plot was flipping, where you have the point counterpoint, the initial
poetry, it rhymes.
Yes, exactly.
Calm down, George Lucas.
But yeah, so written by somebody not R.L. Stine, this story could have taken that dimension as well. Obviously, it's a Fear Street book, so we're not going to have that, but you can see how it would fit in, and so I'll grant it that as well. This is a classic revenge story that contains a lot of the classic motifs, is well written, and really, I think, well executed by R.L. Stine. He hits all the major points. I'm all set up and ready to go to read the next one. I'm excited. Bring it on.
How many popped heads out of 5 would you give this book?
I would give this one 3 exploding heads out of 5. It's definitely better than Myth and Madness. I mean, the characters you actually care about, things that happen around them actually affect them, and they have a story arc. It makes sense. It's good. I really liked it. I'm really looking forward to the next book.
On my Fear Street scale, I think I'd give it a 4 out of 5. Exploded heads.
Nice.
I think one thing that really kind of rubbed me the wrong way was how anachronistic the speech patterns were. These characters, aside from like some of what they had insinuated or talked about being not from the 1990s, the way they spoke was exactly how his characters in his quote-unquote modern day Fear Street books spoke. I mean, I get the fact that he can't write The Crucible or Young Goodman Brown because the people who read this book would toss it out.
You know, he did try to squeeze in a little bit of educational value into it, so give him some props for that.
I gave it a 4 out of 5, but at the end of the day, like, I'm still going to be like, this doesn't really read like something that happened then. And I don't know if it would be possible to write something that truly sounds like it comes from the colonial times while making it interesting and going to the crowd that is reading the books.
I understand what you're saying. He's kind of limited by his format, right? He has to write inside the Fear Street format, and therefore this is as far as he can go in terms of historical accuracy.
And in terms of just characterization, this is not really a character-heavy book per se. It's very plot-heavy. And I feel like he did a good job. It kept a good pace. It was interesting. Things happened and they just kept happening, and there was never really any slow points.
No, it was 3 acts, bam, 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 tied together by the overarching. This is what happens in the future. Stay tuned, because by the end of these 3 books, you will find out exactly what went down at the Fear Street Mansion fire.
It was a really good start for a trilogy, and I am hooked, and I can't wait to see if he has the same second book problem that every other trilogy seems to have.
Yeah, where is he gonna go? Let's take a look at that.
Funny you should say, because I'm currently looking at the cover of the Fear Street Saga, The Secret. So there's a woman on the cover. She is wearing like one of those weird ribbon necklace things, like the ribbon chokers and flowery thing, but I still see some like jewels on it. There's like a weird thing. Is it a hair clip or a necklace or something? But it has flowers on it. I'm not entirely sure. It looks like there's a puddle of blood. But behind this woman, there is a fire, and then there's a silhouette of 2 people, a man and a woman. The woman's in a nightgown, and the man is wearing like normal clothing, and in front of them are 2 gravestones, one for a woman and one for a man. I can't really read the gravestones. It looks like it's the gravestones of 2 children, a boy and a girl. It looks like the girl died at age 7 and the boy died at 15 days. That's what I'm reading. So maybe it's people who died in that Fier mansion fire. So I'm going to say that we're going to continue to follow Ezra Fier's journey as he tracks down, I'm assuming, the remaining Goode to rekindle this blood feud between the 2 families, because why the hell not? And then we're obviously going to hear more about later generation Fiers and Goodes. We're going to follow Nora Goode's little thing. We're still seeing this fire and all that good stuff. People are going to be burned to death. Someone's going to die a horribly fiery death. Murderer gender? I mean, I'm going to say Ezra Fier is going to be the murderer, and it's going to be a male murderer. No one comes off well from the Fier and the Goode families, and every generation there's just going to be a death from one or the other. It's like Buffy, you know? Every generation there is a slayer. For the Fiers and Goodes, for every generation, one of the families is going to kill members of the other family, just this endless cycle of revenge.
I'm going to try to go a little bit more specific here. I'm not sure that Ezra's going to play a really huge role in this one, simply because in the final chapter, he's 21 years old, and it's 1725. And I feel like you really got to hurry things up here, because you got to get up to 1900. And so that leaves 175 years to cover in 2 books. That's a few generations and a half. Probably you want to fast forward to at least the Revolutionary War at this point. The Revolutionary War probably provides like an awesome backdrop. And then you could probably have some kind of frontier thing. So you're probably going to have like one generation that's happening during the Revolutionary War, and then they go further into the frontier and finally get to Ohio sometime after the Revolutionary War. My prediction is, in this book, we're finally going to get to Ohio, and we're finally going to get to actual Shadyside. And by the end of the book, they are going to change their name to Fear, F-E-A-R. That's going to be my prediction. Yes, there's going to be death by fire and witchcraft. Obviously, same thing Anna predicted. You know, anybody could see that coming. I'm not sure how much of a role Ezra's going to play, because by the time the Revolutionary War comes along, he's going to be an old man in his 60s or something. Predictions are set, and I think we're both very excited for the second book.
Well, the saga continues in our next episode.
Stay tuned.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Ret Read Podcast.
Join us again as we continue our journey down Fear Street.
We love hearing from you guys, so feel free to reach out to us at Ret Read Podcast on Twitter and Facebook.
Email us at ret.read.podcast@gmail.com.
Don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe.
Once again, thanks for listening. See you again soon.